Hello, my name is Jitters and welcome back to another episode of Why Nobody Plays, a series of mine where I talk about some of the least picked agents in the game. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about KO. KO is currently the newest agent in the game. When he was first introduced, he was very hyped up and his kit seemed to be really powerful. He came with a new mechanic called Suppression that sounded really broken and his kit seemed like a lot of fun. But over the last couple of months, it seems like his popularity quickly dropped off and right now I only really see him once in a blue moon. And he did actually see some experimentation in pro play when he was first playable in tournaments, but again he quickly dropped off in popularity and his pick rate is fairly low. It's quite sad to see because at first glance he really did seem to have a lot of potential. But here we are 2 months later, and as always I'm going to start off by talking about KO's strengths. The first point I wanted to mention is that KO is a pretty good counter to a lot of common agents. Specifically agents like Sova, Jett, Raze, and Sentinels like Killjoy and Cypher. This is mainly because of his suppression mechanic. Of course, the suppression technically does counter every agent, but the ones I mentioned are hit especially hard by the mechanic. For Sova, KO's knife is able to completely cancel both his drone and his ult. And with how easy it is to use, if you happen to drone a site that KO's on, you basically lose your 400 credit purchase for free every single time. For agents like Raze and Jett, they really like getting into aggressive positions and then using their abilities to help them get out. Turning off their abilities while they're in these positions leaves them really vulnerable since an agent like Jett can be stuck in the open unable to dash. Suppression also slows down their ultimates. Jett isn't affected as much since she can technically wait it out and get her knives back. But for Raze, the suppression lasts longer than her ult, so it effectively cancels it. And losing an ult that costs 8 ult points for a single free ability definitely does not feel good. Finally, Sentinels really rely on their setups to hold down sites and get free information. A KO knife leaves them vulnerable for 8 seconds, which is more than enough time for an enemy team to push onto a site. Just having a KO on the enemy team forces Sentinels to play completely differently. And on a lot of maps, they're forced to play with retake setups to avoid getting their abilities turned off on site and dying for free. The second strength I wanted to mention for KO is that his kit really does seem to have everything you'd want in an agent. He has a flash that seems tailored towards CSGO players, which should make it feel familiar to them. He has a molly that does a ton of damage and makes it really hard to survive if you're stuck in a corner. And with the lineup on the spike, enemies can't half the bomb because they'd most likely die trying, if not die before they even get half. And not to mention that it can be really loud and annoying, which just helps to muffle noise. His knife is strong because of the suppression effect it has like I've mentioned before, but it also has info gathering built into it. And finally, his ult is a really strong engage tool to help his team push onto a site. It turns off enemies' util and can allow him to be rezzed after he's killed. When I first heard about KO, I was actually really excited. I honestly thought that he was going to be a strong agent and that he was going to see a lot of playtime. But 2 months later, I think I can confidently say that he's definitely not one of the most popular picks in the game, not even close. He's one of the least picked agents in the game right now and I think it's time we explore why that might be the case. For starters, his kit can feel very clunky at times. His flash can be deceptively hard to use. The right click is effectively the same as a Phoenix flash a lot of the time but requires more practice to get used to. And the left click is kind of easy to dodge because of how long it takes to go off and the uses aren't always obvious, especially for someone who doesn't play him very often. The knife can be shot if you don't use it on the other side of a wall and it has a really big range, which sounds like a good thing because it's more likely to turn enemies' util off, but sometimes makes it hard to pinpoint where that enemy actually is. And if you use it to clear a close corner, you might be able to target a specific location, but you're also less likely to hit someone with it, which makes it hard to decide what the best way to use it is sometimes. And compared to something like a Sova recon dart, the info it gives just feels uncomparable. You can turn off 2 enemies on a site, but your team still has to clear every single corner to try and find where those enemies are hiding. The next con I wanted to talk about is that his ult isn't really as strong as it sounded like it was. Well, it kind of is, but in solo queue it just does a lot less than you want it to. It's effectively a Phoenix ult, but instead of being better because of the suppression it has built into it, it actually feels worse in practice because it requires more teamwork to be able to make it work. Since your team actually has to push in with you to be able to trade you after you die so that they're actually able to res you. But in solo queue that doesn't always happen, which takes away a lot of the value from the ult, where Phoenix will always get a second life even if his team doesn't push in to trade him. Not only does the ult require more teamwork, but it also gives away his position. This also limits its uses because you can't really use it to play on a site and slow a push very well. You almost have to just give up a site and play a retake with it instead. Which again in solo queue teams don't really play retakes very well and most of the time you would prefer to just not give up a site if you don't have to. Unless you have something like a Killjoy ult that could be round winning. But honestly you can't really compare the strength on retakes between a Killjoy ult and a KO ult. They aren't even close. Finally, the last point I wanted to bring up is that KO is just outclassed in the meta. As a flashing initiator, Skye is just better in every way. Her flash is easier to use. She has better info gathering in her kit with her flashes, her dog, and her ultimate. And she has an AoE heal that can full heal multiple teammates. And on top of that, playing Skye doesn't really have that same clunky feel to her that I find KO does. It's really hard to describe if you haven't tried him yourself, but playing him feels like you're playing a robot, if that makes sense. But besides the obvious Skye, Sova's just way better at him at info gathering, and Breach just has much better CC. He's probably in the worst spot out of any initiator right now. Even worse than Breach, who I honestly think isn't that bad right now but isn't seeing that much play. And yet KO is somehow seeing even less. The thing is, I feel like KO is where Skye was a few months ago, a jack of all trades kind of agent who doesn't really excel at anything but can do a lot of things kind of okay. But where Skye was buffed enough to see meta relevance, KO just doesn't seem to have a real niche to warrant picking him, to be honest. His Molly's okay for post plans, but you might as well have agents like Killjoy or Viper instead. He has a flash, but it's one of the worst ones in the game. He has an info gathering ability, but it's also one of the worst at gathering information in the game. His ult lets him be a meat shield and entry for his team, but it requires too much teamwork. And the list goes on. But just like the other episodes in the series, I always try to come up with ways on how these issues can be solved. For KO, I have a couple of ideas that I think are pretty good. For starters, I think his knife should ping enemies through walls. Think of something like a Sova drone ping where you can see them but it only shows one ping. This would be nice because it solves the problem where your team still needs to check all their corners when you execute on a site. I think to balance this, the knife should need line of sight with the enemies. On top of that, it should have a similar mechanic to Sova's arrows with the different power levels and the ability to make it bounce once or twice. This would still allow for some counterplay and being able to shoot the knife, and it also makes it really easy for players to switch between Sova and KO more easily, since they could share lineups. The second change I think he should have is that the suppression on his ultimate should be able to cancel more ultimates. I want to reiterate that this is specific to just the ultimate and not the knife. Right now, the only ultimates that suppression really affects are Jet Knives, Raze's Rocket, and Sova's Hunter's Fury. I think that when ulting, KO should be able to stop other ultimates. He was created as a sort of way to counter other agents' abilities, and yet he doesn't really do anything to most of the ultimates in the game. I think if you ult near Viper, it should turn off her ult, which would make this the only real counter to her ultimate. It should also turn off something like Killjoy's lockdown from activating, or even turn off her Reyna ultimate. I think this would give KO a nice niche in the meta as a sort of check to these agents. So if an agent like Viper's played almost all the time, more teams would pick KO to be able to counter her. And yes, this could be too strong, but I honestly don't think it would be, since it would only be on his ult, and he would need to be able to keep up with the enemy carry in order to have his ult up every time they do. And if it was too strong, they could also increase the cost of his ult to help balance it. Anyways, that's all I have to say about KO. If you guys agree or disagree with anything I've said in this video, please leave a comment letting me know. Also, if you have any other ideas on how KO could be improved, please leave them in the comments. And if you're interested, please consider following me on Twitch at twitch.tv/jittersval. I stream every Saturday from 2 to 6 p.m. EST. Finally, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe for more Valorant related content.